Welcome back everyone, Josh here and ready for another book review. Today we're going to be looking at Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Published in 1976, Interview with the Vampire is told through an interview with the titular vampire Louis Pointe du Lac, as he chronicles his immortal life to a young reporter. The novel follows his quest for redemption, his search for the nature of his immortality, and his doomed longing for companionship among his immortal brethren. In my view, Interview with the Vampire is still the quintessential modern Gothic vampire novel. Now, it does have its flaws, and I don't think it's the best in the Vampire Chronicles series overall. However, I do think if we're looking at this in the context of Gothic fiction, that it is Rice's best offering in that genre. Part 1. History and Vampire Mythology. Interview with the Vampire contains more than a few winks and nods to Bram Stoker's Dracula, and also other books like Le Fanu's Carmilla. For instance, Interview with the Vampire is told in first person in the form of an interview with some reporter. This seems like a callback to Dracula, which is told through a series of journal entries, newspaper cuttings, and letters. Carmilla is also told through a similar narrative framing device. I always like it when authors have these kind of nods and winks to older books. There are a few other things that Rice does to build upon the vampire mythology of these older texts. One of the main things is that she brings out the sexuality, sensuality, and glamour of vampires like Dracula and Carmilla, and brings it to the fore in ways that were only hinted at in earlier works. If we look at vampires being on a spectrum from Dracula and Carmilla, where we have the brooding dark vampire, and then Buffy's Angel and Edward Cullen as the kind of doe-eyed rebel boy vampires, Rice sits perfectly in the middle of these two. Her vampires are attractive and alluring and seductive in the ways of the later vampires, but at the same time, they're still terrifying, evil creatures. And that's a really hard balance to strike between those two things. Because on the one hand, you have, Mist Sparkle, and on the other hand, you have Bela Lugosi. And she manages to really get that on point, and I think that's one of the big selling points of this book and what makes it such a great book. The last thing that I want to talk about is the mythology of Rice's vampires itself. Rice takes away the religious mythology of the vampire completely. Rice's vampires are not affected by holy water or crosses, and they haven't been placed here by God or condemned by God. The rest of the mythology, at least in this book, remains a mystery, and this adds an element of nihilism to the novel overall. At least when you have a mythology with God in the picture, the vampires are aware that they are eternally damned. There's some purpose beyond themselves. But in this novel, the vampires lack that purpose, and one of the plot points is trying to find that purpose. That gives the novel an existential tragedy that isn't present in earlier novels like Dracula, or in later novels either. Atmosphere. Now, I already mentioned that in terms of the Vampire Chronicles as a whole, Interview with the Vampire is perhaps the best novel in terms of its Gothic atmosphere and its Gothic styling. This comes from two things. One, Rice's writing style, and two, the protagonist, Louis himself. Louis has an incredibly poetic narrative voice, and in terms of his character, he's definitely the embodiment of that tortured soul vampire trope. In fact, some might even say he might have been the beginning of the tortured soul vampire trope. When you're reading the novel then, it really feels as though you are listening to the interview of someone who actually has lived for 200 years. And the narrative style is such that it reminds me of those older 19th century Gothic novels. Some people do find this to be a downside to the novel. They find that the writing style is a bit too ornate, a bit too purple prose, and while I can certainly see that to a point, I think it makes sense given the context of the novel. Given that Louis is a 200-year-old vampire, it makes sense for him to speak in the way that he does. Also, I find that given the novel is relatively short, the writing style, at least for me, never really gets all that overbearing. So if you like the style of those 19th century Gothic romance novels, then I do think you'll probably like Rice's style. And if you're kind of a bit when it comes to purple prose, maybe not so much. However, given that this novel is a pretty short entry, it's still worth a try, and I do think it's something that, while Rice always has that ornate style, it's less of a problem, at least in the two novels that follow this one. And that's because we're not following Louis. Characters. The selling point for me in this novel are the characters. Without the characters, we have a dark, depressing novel where terrible things happen and there's really not all that much light to be had. Now that's fine enough, but you need to have interesting characters then, because otherwise I don't just want to be depressed. The characters, fortunately, are fantastic in this book. The four that I want to talk about in this video are the principal vampires, Louis, our protagonist, Louis's creator, Lestat, their vampire daughter Claudia, and Armand, the leader of a vampire coven who falls in love with Louis. Let's start with the weakest character, who unfortunately happens to be Louis himself. The problem that I have with Louis is that he is just kind of boring at times. Like I said before, he is the embodiment of that tortured soul trope, and when you're at parts of the novel where it's just focusing on his internal monologues and his psychology, it can just get a bit whiny, and you just kind of want to slap him around the face and tell him to get over whatever it is that he's whinging about this week. That being said, I do think Louis is one of the more human characters in the novel, and while I'm glad that in later novels Rice shifts the protagonist to other vampire characters who are way more interesting, when it comes to the first entry and you're identifying with a character, it makes sense to do that with a character that is more human than less human. And that is what makes Louis a good protagonist, at least on those grounds. It's just a bit of a shame that he couldn't have been just slightly less whiny and a little bit more interesting. In direct contrast to Louis, we have Armand, who is one of the more fascinating characters in the story, even though he has a much smaller role in comparison to the other three characters that I'm going to talk about. Armand is one of the vampires who really brings out the sensuous glamour that Rice is going for with her vampires. The guy runs a coven of vampires where they feed off of their victims live on stage in front of an incredibly naive audience, so it doesn't really get much more gothic glam than that. Also, his fascination and obsession with Louis is one of the high points of the novel overall, and leads to some of the most tragic parts of the novel, and arguably the series overall. Next we have Lestat, who brings out the gothic glamour, although in a more extroverted way than we see in Armand. Right from the get-go, Lestat comes across as a brattish, rich aristocrat who's deeply vain and in love with himself, and in love with his own immortality, in a way that the other vampires often aren't. This leads to some great personal clashes between Lestat's character and Louis as they try and live together as immortals over the years. In fact, something that becomes an interesting talking point for the later books is how much of Louis' depiction of Lestat in this novel is actually accurate, and how much of that is grounded in Louis' dislike of Lestat's wild and capricious nature. They have probably one of the fiercest relationships in the book, second only to the relationship that these two men have with their vampire daughter, Claudia. Claudia is probably my favourite character in this novel. Her backstory is also one of the most tragic. Because she was made into a vampire when she was just 5 years old by Louis and Lestat, she is trapped in this 5-year-old's body forever. Over the years she becomes more and more intelligent and more worldly, but everyone still perceives her as a child. And because she has a child's body, she is as vulnerable as a child in a lot of ways, even though she has the vampire strength to some extent. Because of this, she has a deep-seated resentment towards both Louis and Lestat, but at the same time she recognises that she needs them if she's going to survive this immortal existence. This leads to a great relationship dynamic, and Claudia will do terrible things to these two throughout the novel, but then at the same time will also show so much tenderness towards them at other times. I think at one point she describes to Louis their relationship as one that is locked together in hatred, which perfectly sums up the dynamic that this very dysfunctional family have with one another. And that to me is the beauty of this novel. Each of these vampires need companionship, but the people who they choose for companions are oftentimes incompatible with them, either because of their personality, or they've made the person that they wanted to be a companion into a vampire, and then that person resents them for it because they don't want to have this existence. Rice does a really good job of making you empathise and see the tragedy in being a vampire, which again is something that gets lost in later books, when oftentimes becoming the vampire is the end goal for the human protagonist. That's not really the case in this book. These vampires are deeply flawed and deeply miserable throughout most of their lives. Even someone like Lestat, who outwardly is brash and loud and seems to be having a good time, has moments of weakness and vulnerability. Overall then, Interview the Vampire is a wonderful piece of gothic horror. It's got some complex and interesting characters who have dynamic relationships with one another. It's got an interesting mythology on a creature that has, even though that vampires have been done to death to some extent now, that mythology still makes Rice's vampires particularly distinctive and interesting. I also like how this novel explores the less than glamorous side to being a vampire. It explores the nihilism and the tragedy, as well as the glamour. I'll admit that it's not the best in the series overall, partly because of Louis as the protagonist that we follow being one of the weaker characters, and also partly because Rice's writing style can be a little bit ornate at times. Fortunately, these two things are things I think that improve, especially in the next 2 volumes, when Rice shifts focus to more interesting characters, and where she builds on her vampire mythology. Okay, that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the Vampire Chronicles? So far, I've only read the first few volumes of the series, so for those of you that have read the later books, I'd love to get your thoughts on those later books, as well as your thoughts on this review, and also if there's anything that you think you want me to review next or in the future, definitely let me know and I will consider it. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to support this channel, and I'll see you all in the next video.